Welcome to this lecture of Culture and Literature 1.2. This lecture is created for the School of Education Department of the Rotterdam University of Applied Sciences, and my name is Ahmet Şakyoglu. During this lecture, you will be introduced to the amazing world of young adult literature. Like always, don't forget to take notes, and let's dive right in. Again, let's start with the lecture goals. At the end of this lecture, you, the student, can describe the characteristics of young adult literature. You can explain narrative perspective and identify first-person narrator. You can understand the impact of voice and tone upon a text. You can develop metaphorical competence. You can describe the genre of epistolary literature. You can explain the importance of young adult literature. Today we will be focusing, obviously, on young adult literature. We'll first go over some titles over the past 70 years of the genre, and we'll finish by quickly looking at the two novels you will read for this course. But in order to identify a young adult novel, we'll need to look at the characteristics of it, and of course the possible genres that encompass it. In order to analyze the novels, we'll need to look at plot and theme, and you'll be able to use a plot structure diagram. We'll also look at perspectives and voice and tone. Then we'll talk a little about conceptual metaphors, and finally, we'll finish off with the usefulness of young adult literature. Wizards, vampires, and dystopian future worlds didn't always dominate the young adult genre. Before Harry, Katniss, Damon, and Stefan, there was so much more. Not that there is anything wrong with these two guys, they're great. But there is still a lot of young adult literature that deals with other issues. You just need to know where to look. Let's start with a brief tour through the ages to see the journey of the genre. Many of the books that we now consider to be young adult texts were initially written for adults and only later categorized as young adult. If we go back to the 50s, we can find one of the books that we're going to read later, which is Lord of the Flies. Another well-known book that can now be categorized as young adult is The Catcher in the Rye. One of the first books to be written and published for young adults was The Outsiders, and it still remains the quintessential young adult book today. Another one from the 60s is Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret. The 70s and 80s brought with them the adventure of horror for a younger audience, and the ever-so-loved high school drama, like Sweet Valley High. And we all know what magical thing happened around the 90s. Harry Potter brought in a lot of new young adult readers and paved the way for other new talents to enter the genre. The 2000s brought the Twilight Saga, and the books really are better than the film, at least that's what I think. Of course, we also got the Hunger Games, of which Suzanne Collins is now publishing a spin-off set in the years before Snow was president. And then the 2010s brought tears to our eyes with some amazing works from, among others, John Green. The Fault in Our Stars is an amazing read and also a very good option for higher year pupils in secondary schools. For our class, we are going to discuss The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime by Mark Haddon and Life on the Refrigerator Door by Alice Kuipers. Make sure you have read the novels before the corresponding classes. This is a requirement for all the classes you attend for this course, so keep up with the required reading list. The characteristics of young adult literature are important to remember. First of all, the viewpoint is generally that of the young. There is a young protagonist, and the story usually makes use of first-person narration with a young narrator. As the story progresses, the narrator grows and changes with the story. Now, secondly, there is an emerging independence. Though adults may be present, the young protagonist solves the problems. The protagonist learns something new about herself or the adults, for example parents, learns about adulthood, etc. Thirdly, a young adult novel is current and fast-paced. It is often quick to read and quick to develop. Some may be longer, depending on how well known the author is, but the novel is often a page-turner. It may reflect current circumstances or situations and show difficulty rather than presenting a role model. As you might have noticed, young adult literature uses popular speech and trends. Now there's a big variety of young adult novels out there. Subjects can be about growing up, love, relationships, problem solving, and the genres are as varied as fiction, nonfiction, poetry, biography, and even graphic novel. Young adult novels also have different perspectives. Think of cultural, ethnic, economic, and fantasy. And yes, they're quite often optimistic. Sometimes they hold back till the very end, but more often than not, they are in fact optimistic. The protagonist may be smarter than adults and may be looked up to by the young adult readers. The protagonist takes charge, matures, and overcomes her obstacles and struggles. And what they learn may lead to loss of innocence. So these stories, as you can see, deal with real emotions. Emotional struggle is truthfully portrayed through means of social skills, adolescent changes, so becoming an adult, personal ideology or ethics. Development of self is very important. You can see this in self-awareness, self-identity, and self-responsibility. Like I said, young adult literature is not just a genre on its own. It can in fact have many different genres. As you can see here, like historical fiction, fairy tale, poetry, fiction, mystery, nonfiction, fantasy, biography, fable, science fiction, adventure, autobiography, many more. Life on the Refrigerator Door is an epistolary, and that is a genre where the novel is primarily written through letters. Epistle means letter. In Life on the Refrigerator Door, communication between the characters is shown through post-its. The advantages of the novel in letter form are that it presents an intimate view of the characters' thoughts and feelings. In a narrative or creative writing, a plot is the sequence of events that make up a story, whether it's told, written, filmed, or sung. The plot is the story, and more specifically, how the story develops, unfolds, and moves in time. Plots are typically made up of 5 elements. 1. Exposition, as you can see at the bottom. At the beginning of the story, characters, settings, and the main conflict are typically introduced. Then you get the rising action. The main character is in crisis, and events leading up to facing the conflict begin to unfold. The story becomes complicated. Then you get at the highest point, number 3, the climax. At the peak of the story, a major event occurs in which the main character faces a major enemy, fear, challenge, or other source of conflict. The most action, drama, change, and excitement occurs here. And then on the way down, you get number 4, the falling action. So that's where the story begins to slow down and work towards the end, tying up loose ends. And then finally comes the resolution. Also known as the denouement, the resolution is like a concluding paragraph that resolves any remaining issues and ends the story. Plots, also known as storylines, include the most significant events of the story and how the characters and their problems change over time. So the plot is a collection of events that promotes the theme. One of the first questions to ask upon hearing someone has written a story is, what's it about? Or what's the point? Short answers may range from love to betrayal, or from the coming of age to the haziness of a memory. The main idea, topic, or point of a story is its theme. It is what the author wants you to take away from the story. Now, to understand the difference between plot and theme, let's look at the story of the 3 little pigs. The plot of the story, on the left, is that a wolf tries to blow down the houses made by 3 different pigs. The theme, however, is about the lesson that taking your time to do something right is beneficial. So there you have it. Now this plot structure diagram, which can be downloaded from the course folder on Cum Laude, is a very useful tool to help you summarize and analyze a novel that you're reading, either for this course or in general. Try filling this in for the young adult novels you've been reading for this course. We'll use this in the corresponding classes later in the course. Let's talk about perspective. When you read a story, the narrator or storyteller controls everything you know about the characters and events. A writer's choice of a narrator determines the point of view of the story, the perspective from which the story is told. There are three main types of narrators, or points of view, and these are first person, second person, and third person limited. Now, narration and dialogue are not the same thing. Dialogue is when a character speaks, and this is usually visualized by quotation marks. Narration is when the narrator speaks. When we identify the narrative perspective, it's about the narrator, so the person who tells the story. We're not looking at dialogue. We don't care what characters say, only the narrator's voice matters. So how do you identify first-person narrative? Obviously a lot of I's. The narrator is a character in the story and uses first-person pronouns. Also, we don't know the thoughts or feelings of other characters. The second-person narrative is usually used for instructions and uses you, so from your perspective. An example would be the line in the cooking book. First, gather your materials. Add 1 cup of sugar to something else. And the third-person narrative usually isn't involved. He tells other people's stories, so a lot of he's, she's, and character names. Now, the third-person narrative can also be divided in 3 types. It all depends on whether or not the narrator tells about thoughts and feelings of other characters. We'll not get into that right now. Let's look at the writer's voice. A writer's voice is his or her unique use of language and overall style. Just as you can identify your friend's voice on the phone, you can often identify a writer from a work's voice. Narrators are sometimes described as having a voice created by their manner of speaking, word choice, and tone. A narrator's voice can affect our view of characters and events as well as shape the story's tone. If you look at the text in this presentation, you can see the voice of a narrator. And I underlined what stands out. So let's go over them real quickly. What do you think you're doing? I shouted. Put it down, or else. You're not wearing it, Kyla muttered. You never wear it. Why can't I? Because it's mine. You're so selfish, Kyla muttered, yamming the shirt back onto a hanger. She slammed the closet door. Get out of my room, I told her. I just about had it with my younger sister. She was always stealing my very favorite clothes. So the narrator sounds angry and immature. At some point, you may have been told to watch your tone of voice. Your tone, or your attitude, affects your voice, or how you sound to other people. Writers use tone and voice to show attitude and to make the writing distinctive. A story's tone, the attitude its speaker takes towards a subject, character, or audience, can be humorous, serious, or loving, and there are of course many more possibilities. In the example here, notice how individual words and phrases contribute to the tone. So we have, Sonia lifted the puppy to her chest and stroked his soft fur. Stretched out, the puppy was almost as big as she was. Nuzzling her face in the puppy's neck, Sonia whispered gently, It's okay. The puppy shook in the presence of newcomers, but he softened now in Sonia's arms. So in this case, the tone would be loving or caring. We've talked about metaphors during the poetry lecture, so we're not going to go into too much detail here. But for the curious incident of the dog in the nighttime, it is good to briefly look at some examples of conceptual metaphors. Now, we use conceptual metaphors to make an abstract concept more concrete. So a good example would be time is money, right? We all know that one. Now I'm going to use love in a few ways to describe these conceptual metaphors. So if we see love as magic, there are 2 examples. He cast a spell on me, or she is bewitching. So these both relate to magic. But if you look at Love is War, she pursued him relentlessly, and he won her hand in marriage, so to win something. Now, Love as a Patient, this is a sick relationship, or the marriage is dead, it can't be revived. This all have to do with illnesses or even death. And finally, Love is Madness. So you ever heard of "she drives me out of my mind"? Or quite the opposite, "I'm crazy about her." So these are all conceptual metaphors. And here's an interesting fact. In 2011, Littlemore, Chen, Kuster, and Barnden found out that 42% of language difficulty in classrooms arises from metaphorical expressions. 42%. And this lack of metaphorical competence inhibits comprehension of texts, speech, cultural knowledge, and linguistic awareness. As you read The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime, think of Christopher, who struggles with metaphors. Okay, think of some of the sentences that he describes. Okay, look them up. We will discuss this in class, so try and find some yourself, and maybe you'll see some that I haven't found. So the usefulness of young adult literature is linked to the characteristics of the genre. When looking at the viewpoint of the young adult literature allows readers to safely experience the content through the narrator's voice. As for emerging independence, it leads readers to look more realistically at themselves and/or their relationships. Now again, because the young adult novel is current and fast-paced, it is engaging to readers. There's a limited number of characters, it uses a popular language, so it builds interest in reading. Also, because of its variety, it allows safe exploration of subject matter that may even be taboo, like sex, drugs, abuse, violence, or illness, and presents it from diverse perspectives. A young adult novel is optimistic, so it is encouraging to see the protagonist overcoming challenges, and it could even be inspiring to the reader. And the real emotions in the story allows for safe exploration of development of personal feelings. And of course, what's more practical is that young adult novels are easy to read as a project in class. There are many levels of difficulty. They usually offer group or class assignments. It has more in-depth story than the short story, and last but not least, it appeals to teenagers. And young adult novels could even be stepping stones to more classical literature. Percy Jackson fans could get interested in reading the Iliad or the Odyssey. Twilight could lead to Wuthering Heights. Absolutely True Diary of a Part-Time Indian would be a stepping stone to The Scarlet Letter. Now again, I would like to remind you that you should have a good understanding of the topics in this lecture so you can actively participate in the regular class. Participate in the group discussions and make sure you ask questions if you don't understand. Note that all of the topics discussed here might help you prepare your assignments. This is the end of this lecture.